foam of the sea then is the Milky Way itself, the galaxy, as it would actually be during these solstices and equinoxes. At this point, that they say this golden disk would be aligned, and actually with the center of the galaxy, and pull in this information. But what actually happened was that the galaxy, the Milky Way, would align itself on the horizon of the Earth right before sunrise, and that the sun would itself rise in the center of the galaxy. And knowing that actually occurs, and then looking at the history of the Spanish chroniclers of the area of the Inca, you find that they had an extraordinary knowledge that we're only coming up to speed with now. With this idea that the center of the galaxy somehow aligns at these quarter points of the precession of the equinox, that we are approaching one right now. You combine that with the information that's in the Mayan calendar, which points to 2012 actually as being that point where we are aligned to the center of the galaxy.
Right. And
that there's an end point and then again a beginning or a rebirth. These fit together, even though they're separated by thousands of miles and many thousands of years. There's a pre-Inca. I mean, there was chronicles of pre-Inca existing far beyond written history, and the farther back you go, the more sophisticated they seem to be. And these ideas are also connected, of course, to the pseudepigrapha and the apocrypha of the Western canon, the Bible itself, writings of the Hebrew sages. These all fit exactly what the Mayan and the Inca and the Aztec and the Toltec and all these groups were talking about. But not only that, you can go and open up your regular old James Bible to Genesis 6 and find information that connects to the giants, the story of their creation of large cities, this idea that they actually had a civilization and they were in rule of it before they were destroyed. You can find that in the Old Testament, especially Genesis 6, where it's actually talking about the giants that were in the earth and that they had actually been the product of a breeding program by some extraterrestrial force, which, as Christian, I believe, was angelic, but rebel angelic. They created the Nephilim, and Nephilim in Hebrew just means the fallen one. From that point, you can launch into all the other creation myths around the globe, about as far back as you can actually access them.
Right.
And they all have that salient point.
So
there was a destructive epic, but there is going to be another one that's coming.
So, David, what I want to ask you right there is that, do you think that this rebel force, obviously then led by Lucifer, if you will, that they came down to Earth and basically at that point set up the entire megalithic system of incredible monuments that we can see from all over the world? Because basically wherever we focus a little bit more on, we can see that we can find them in South America, in North America, we can find them in throughout Europe, in Asia, certainly in Africa as well, and Middle East, Baalbek, all of these incredible sites that have these, as you pointed out in many of your lectures, these incredible, trilitons that they weigh, immense, immense stone structures basically that they put together. Do you think that this have come from the same group of beings then that came from the outside?
This is one of the most fascinating points, I think, that you could have touched on, and that's the commonality of this origin of civilization, as it comes from the civilization myths of the greatest antiquity that we actually have resources of. I guess focusing on the idea of the name of these creatures to begin with.
Yeah.
And one of the greatest examples of an explanation of the descent of these things is the apocryphal book or the pseudepigraphic work of Enoch, which I guess is the Book of Enoch.
Yeah.
And Enoch talks about what's translated into English as the Watchers, them coming down and actually breeding with daughters of Adam. And the actual writing for the Watcher is a word that would be pronounced more like ear or eerie in the Hebrew.
Really?
And the Semitic word is used all the time for these beings, ear. But if you look in the Old Testament, you can find that word written Ayin Resh in the Hebrew letters is also used in exact the same form as the word for city, ear. So the first time you actually read of where Enoch builds a city, or not Enoch, but Cain, the first man who ever builds a city, who is Cain, it talks about the city being called an ear. If you read in the book of Enoch about the Watchers, they're called ear. Ear is actually the Greek root for Ares, god of Mars, or even the place of Mars itself. It's an absolute connection when it comes to the etymology. And historically, if you look back far enough, you'll find that there's a connection between the worship of Mars and this idea of learning how to build and cause civilization to come into being, and this idea also of making war with other groups, and Mars itself as a planet.
Yeah.
And jumping all the way to the future again, to the idea of when the end cataclysm comes, when this next cataclysm that eschatology looks forward to, of biblical prophecy, and many New Age groups, and all these ancient civilizations that have records looking, back into incredible antiquity, they always have a focus towards the future and the next cataclysm that's coming.
Yeah.
They talk about these watchers coming back also. And that's our focus now, amazingly, is again on Mars. And the UFO phenomena seems to be focused on the geometry that is around this whole manifestation of the megaliths, what we find on Mars, what we've actually found on Cydonia Mars, which my first book was about. That connection goes back and forth so many times that it's actually kind of overwhelming.
It is.
To get it all together and to set it out so that someone actually can see that the repetitions of the idea that Mars brought civilization into being on this Earth, and that somehow it will be resurrected again.
Yeah.
That we're not actually now at the peak of civilization. The ancients actually forward to a golden age or resurgence of a golden age through the agency of these beings that came once, were wiped off the planet, and are supposed to come back.
And David, when you were speaking about these rebel angels, watchers, or even the messengers, as you call them in one of your talk, you said that they can't avoid doing the symbolic things that they do anymore, that we can avoid following the law of gravity. And I think that's a really nice way to put it, because as you just mentioned, that the connections between all of these, symbolic communications, if you will, if we compare, if we look at the Mars-Earth connection, or if we look at some of the place names and so forth, it's just incredible. But I think that you've used a word for that, and I think you refer to it as theurgy. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit, and what it means, and why it is important to signify something like a place in time, and even the naming of the thing, if you will.
Yeah, the idea that these beings are so stuck when it comes to what it is they do, the repetition patterns that they actually do things in, is because their nature, what they were designed to do is just communicate. They're emissaries. They communicate from a higher level to a lower level. And not only that, they communicate in between themselves. And their very name just means messenger. Angelos in Greek, and Malachim, I guess, in Hebrew. Very same idea. The name just means messenger. That's their reason for being. And when they actually manifest through their activities now, it's completely a message. It's a complete thought, but it goes beyond what most humans think of as a communication, because they're not just left to our frame of reference. They have an extent that comes outside our temporal existence.
Right.
Which means that they can think forward into and actually interact with one moment in time, at one event at a time. They will still have events that connect to that they've foreseen many years ahead. And it also stands to reason that if it's at a higher level than human intellect, whenever an angel would interact on this plane of our existence, that there would be pure thought, which is mathematical and geometrical.
Yeah.
So that you can actually anticipate that sort of communication being conveyed whenever you see a UFO sighting, even something that seems mundane.
Right.
And especially something that is extraordinary, like, say, a recovery or encounters of the third or fourth, other encounters where you have mass sightings or UFO flaps.
Right.
You have to pay particular attention to when it happened, where it happened, the coordinates of where it happened, the number of objects. I mean, all these things are important because it's pure communication, and it's at a level that's far higher than you would anticipate from our perspective.
And David, would you say that it isn't until it also reaches the mainstream that this kind of communication becomes important? But because in many cases it seems to be that many, like let's say we look at a UFO sighting, for instance, then that can be something very hidden away, so to speak, and the mass media never touches upon it. But then once in a while you get these kind of large events, like let's say the Phoenix Light, or if I don't know if you've heard about it yet, David, but there's this very recent one just now that occurred, interestingly enough, now at the summer solstice, just yesterday, or these cops were chasing a UFO over Cardiff in Wales in the UK, and allegedly they were almost colliding with the UFO and a shopper, and this has become rather big in the media now. But anyway, my question here, I guess, is that is it only when this become large, like in the mainstream, that it is of this importance, or does it also apply to when it's not such a big event, so to speak?
Yeah, it also applies when it's not such a big event, and this falls back into the temporal sort of control that these messengers have. Yeah. Because they realize that sometimes what they're doing is just a catalyst for a greater event in the future. But do they know actually that what they've actually, manifested in the ground, let's just, for sake of argument, say that there is such thing as a UFO-created crop circle.
Right.
And that crop circle is actually a pure thought and pure information that, although we may not understand it in the weeks that we are investigating it after it's actually occurred, somebody a year later or 2 years later will actually decode it. Or there will be an event that correlates to it that will have occurred, and the understanding will suddenly become widespread. However, there's other things that are happening too. Some of these images that you see in crop circles actually do stimulate the human mind in ways that we aren't quite up to speed with. In the same way that I was saying that the Tiwanaku geoglyphs also supposedly were supposed to heighten men's awareness at a specific time. They're calibrated to work at a point in time, just like if you set a clock. And that's what I mean then by theurgy, because basically the word just means to bend or to manipulate, almost architecturally, the will of God. And in the pagan religions and in the occult, it's not so much the will of God, but spiritual forces outside of that, out of the God of gods.
Right.
And this, in the Judeo-Christian framework, would be an angelic force. And right. We know they're aligned on two sides, for and against the will of God. You know that there is actually then some conflict that's going on.
Yeah.
And that this manifestation that they place here on Earth addresses that conflict. And so to get actually a reading on what the heck's going on with it, there has to be some sort of handbook. For me, it's the Old Testament, it's the New Testament.